Welcome to this second video regarding the openIMIS development in the backend. I am Eric Darchy from Blue Square. This is what we are going to talk in this module. First, we'll look at the security, how we can make sure that we have user authentication, how they can access the data, which data exactly they can access. We're going to see how we can extend existing modules and make sure that your module can be extended as well. We'll see how to do the internationalization, so the translation of your application, so it can be in any language for your country, and how to do the unit testing into the application. First, let's add some security into the video module that we created in the last video. So in the previous video, we added a new module. In this module, we created an object, a video object, with only a name. So we're now going to add a new URL. We get a text field. We want it to be nullable, so we're going to say null equals true. This impacts the database, but we can also use blank equals true, meaning that all the forms generated by Django will have this parameter as optional as well. Then we can add, for example, a location, and that will refer to a foreign key. That foreign key would be a location object. If I do this, I can import the object, location models, and here I have my location object. But this object is in the location module, and it will be a bit make the loading of the various modules potentially difficult, because there will be a specific order to use, and it can introduce cyclic dependencies. To do that, to avoid that, we can remove this dependency and just say location.location. Then we can just try to make the migration for this. So the make migrations task that we had created. So I'll remind you that it's like this. If I do a -- name to give it a more useful name, so in this case I'll make URL loc, for example. I just run that, and it says, oh, you need a onDelete. When you have a foreign key like this, you must specify what you're going to do if the referring element is deleted. So the possibilities are in the models. So you can say, for example, set null, or you can say cascade. In this case, we can do a cascade. So if you let the autocomplete do, you will get this, the parenthesis there. This is not going to work. If I do this, you see that it says cascade missing 4 parameter required positional arguments. This is because we don't want to call the cascade element. We just want to say that when there's a delete, it's going to call this method. We don't need to call it now. So remove the parenthesis and do the make migrations. And you see that here it's saying that we have a new element that is mandatory. So what we're going to do is, what we need to do is to provide an element that will be used as a default. We don't want to do that because we want to have this optional. So we have to add also the null equals true, and blank equals true as well. Let's run the make migrations again. There we are. It created a URL loc object, a file, and you can see that this file contains the new foreign key, the new text field, and it depends. If you look at the object, you see that there is an initial there, and it's also requiring an object that is in the location element. So it's going to have this one also as the dependency for these objects. When you want to do the migrate, so to create these objects, you can just use the migrate task. And if you want later to go back to your previous version, you can just say video, and then the 001, 3 zeros, initial, and that will bring you back to the previous version. Of course, in this case, we just want to do a normal migrate. So just run this. This should be enough now to switch back to the browser. We're back into the graphical. Now, if I look at the documentation that's currently loading, go to the query, videos, and you can see that the result is a video type, edge, video is equal to type edge, and the node. And we have the video name, that is a string, URL, and location, that is referring to the location GQL type. So it guessed properly that the location is a reference. Now let's take a query on this. So if I query on the videos, I'll take everything. Then in the videos, I don't need a page info in this case. I can say edges, node, in the node, take the ID, there's the video name, then we have the URL and location. If I just do this like this, location, of course, is an object, it's a sub-object, so I need to specify what I want from the location. So I want the location, the ID, the name, and the code. So now if I execute this, I find only one record that we created before. So now I have added some data. I have still the same test we had made, one with an address, and one with a location as well. So the first thing we're going to do is to make sure that the anonymous user that I am right here is not allowed to access the data. So to do that, we have defined our video query to be this item, but we can also add some specific precisions here. So we have resolve videos, and I can add the info that's going to pass to me, and just accept any other parameter. First thing we're going to do is to make sure that the user, so that's the info.context.user, that's a Django user, is not anonymous. So if it's anonymous, I'm going to say that I'm going to raise a permission denied unauthorized. So if I let this refresh, so I call this, I can see that I am unauthorized. Now, if I take my logged in user here, I can see that I can still access. But we might want to do some more fine-grained permissions. So now if I try and use the has permissions, I can say that if it doesn't have the permission that I described here, it's going to say unauthorized. So I'm still unable to do it from the anonymous window. But if I do it from the authorized, from the authenticated user, I can still access it. But it's not really very convenient because this specific magic value is not really right. So what we should do normally is to have in the apps.py, we should have a configuration here. We can see here that we still have the my module. So we're going to take it from another module and just adapt it. Here we go. So what it's going to do is we have the name of the module here. We have a default video permissions for the query. We have here the ready method is going to be used by Django to initialize the query when everything is loaded and ready to use. So this is going to call it, and we're going to take the default configuration if it doesn't find it. Then it's important also to make sure that reference to here, otherwise it's not going to be loaded. So now we need to restart the application because it's an initialization, and while it's loading we can still go to this place, and instead of using this specific value we can say the video config dot this. So we can import the value, save it, and put a breakpoint. Now that we're in here, we can see the value of this parameter, and we can see that it's now the one that we have defined here in the default. So this is still going to work. And as we can see, it does. What we're going to do also is to go back to the admin screen. Here we can go to the module configurations. And you can see that we have the core that we created earlier. So we're going to create one for video, still backend, version 1. We are going to set the permissions to 000. Now that's saved. If I go back to my application, I need to reload it, of course. Now if I run this again, we are here in the configuration, in the call, and we can see that the value has been changed to all zeros. So this is going to refuse the access to this URL without having to change the code. So this is really a flexible method for the permissions. Naturally, this applies in the same way to the mutations. If I close this, go back to the query here, we can see the details, and we can see that this location, it was Ulta, code R1. Now we want to limit the access that we want to give to the users. So what we want to filter this information. So what we can do into the Python code, we can get back to the schema, and the schema itself allows you to define a get query set. So let's see how it works on a different data set. So if we go back to the claim module and we look at the queries, we can see here that we have the claim object, we have our various elements, and we have a class method that is get query set. This one will get a query set and an information. That is in turn calling the claim.querySet object with the same information. And this is where we're going to do the actual security. So in this case, we're still getting the user as a parameter. The first thing we're going to do is the filter query set. I'll explain in a second what it is. Then I'll do if it's an instance of a user, then I can just, of a result info, sorry. I can get the user context user. Then if we say that there is row security and the user is anonymous, we're going to say that we don't return any data. If the row security that we defined in our sample server, we said row security false in this case. So we don't have row security, so we are just going to return the query set. But if we had this as default value to true, it would check whether the users have specific access. So if it's a technical user, there's nothing we can check. And if it's an actual user from the platform that has logged to the authentication of the platform, we will have the access to the health facility ID of the user, and we can do a query set.filter on the health facility of the user. Then if the user is not limited, well, we'll just define all the possible locations that they can access in the user districts. Then we just simply return the query set. What we have here in the filter query set is for the elements, since the claim inherits from the version model. The version model itself has the legacy ID and the validity from validity 2 from the base version model. And this means that they offer already the limits for these for the valid data. So you can just use that to already do the filtering on these objects. So now if we want to do something very simple, because we don't have this versioning, so if I go back to my video models, here I'm going to need the query set. So I'll add a def get query set. Now, if I just type it like this, we have the self. We don't want a self, we just want something that is generic. So here we have a class, so it's a a class method. We'll get an potentially existing query set, and then the info. Now, if we go back to the claim, we have the query set and the user. So now what we have to do in the filter query set, if it does not exist already, the query set that we have passed, we have to create it. And then we do the filters on it. Because it might be that you're just calling it without any query. So in our video, we just say that if query set, if not query set, then we just query set equals, in this case we're in the video, so dot objects dot all. Again, the dot objects is not visible from the community edition of PyCharm, but if you have the pro version, you'll get all the tooling for this. Now we're just going to return the query set. So now, if I want to, I can do this. So that's the, no. So why do we have this resolve info? The resolve info is used when you are calling from the GraphQL. If you're calling from the REST API, so like for the Fire, you are actually directly passing the user itself and not the object resolve info. The resolve info contains additional information from the GraphQL. So in this case, we have the user, and we can say we can access the user here. But to see how it works, let's just put a breakpoint here and just try to execute this. But we are not really calling this get query set because we have put it on the model itself. We need to call it from the query itself. So from the schema, the query here, apart from the class meta, I can say here that I want to have a class method def get query set, yes. And then we'll do the video dot get query set. It's not no CS, it's a query set and info. You could have additional checks here in the specifically GraphQL, but normally you would just pass it through. Now, when we get the query, it will filter the query set, and then go do that. And we get into my breakpoint. So now, what will we do with the user? So if I check the user itself, you can see that it's a user, but it's actually a technical user, and it's called admin. So the user itself, the user object from Django, can be either an interactive user or a technical user. In this case, we have created a super user, and we authenticated into the admin part with this one. So it's a technical user here, an admin. So if I go to my technical user, I can see that it's not anonymous, so that's fine. It's a super user, but there is no information about my location. So in this case, I could say that if the user is anonymous, we're going to filter the query set just say ID equals -1, for example. That's an impossible statement. So we are not an anonymous user in this case. But if I say now, if the user is a super user, but in this case, I'm going to limit what he can see to the data that has no location, for example. Location is null equals true. So now if I let it go, you can see that it's going to refresh here. There you go. If I go back to the browser, I can find the same query again. Just let it run. And you see that you only have the ones that don't have a location. Now, this is for the technical user. If I have an interactive user, I can do much more than that, of course. But in this case, we don't have it. So what I'm going to configure a proxy that allows me to set this information. So now I have configured a server to use an interactive user. So if I do that now, if I check my user information, I can see that I'm actually now JHOS0011, and this is an interactive user. So I have an I user, and this user is limited to a health facility. There's no user district, and there's a health facility ID. The user is a special class because it's going to take any methods or any property that we are going to request, like the isSuperUser, and it's going to delegate it to the actual user, so the technical or the interactive user. But if you take you have a technical user and you do user dot health facility ID. This works for this one, but if you have a technical user, it's not going to work. So what you have to do is, like we've seen in the claims, that you have to check that there's a property on the set. You have to check that the property exists on the user that has a health facility ID. But here we are going to make it simple, so just use the health facility ID. Then we can say, for example, I can do a query set equals query set dot filter location equals the user dot health facility ID. So I've had this one, and let's try again. So there was a timeout here, so that's why we have an error. Can sometimes take a bit of time to refresh. So now that we are here, I'll just let it run, and we can see that there is only the one that had a location. So this is how you make sure that you don't get any further information. But if you look at the information you have here, you could also have from the location, you could find all the information from this location to go to the list that we have here. So if I get the locations, so if we take the location here, I'm going to take the name that is Ulta. We have this specific one. What we can do over here is to find from the list of possibilities. We have the video set here, and the video set allows me to see all the videos for this element. So I have here the name, the video. Of course, we have to use the edges node. We have the ID, the video name, and the URL. But it also means that we are not going to be able to see anything else. But even in this case, we have, of course, limited to Ulta. So if we were to check for another one, like Rapta, we will be able to see the location, because that's allowed. I'm going to remove breakpoint. I can see now this other location, but even if there was some data over there, we could not see anything else in there, because it's still going to go through the get query set. And still the same applies from any REST interface like the Fire API. Now that we have security, we're going to extend the existing modules and use the signals that they are emitting to add some functionality to it. now that we have this video module that's quite independent by itself, we want to act on something that happens in a different module. If we want to say, for example, we're going to take a very simple example that we want to create, when we create an attachment to a claim, we want to make sure that if there is a URL that is defined, it is also in the video as a video object. In order to do that, we could modify the claim code so that it calls the video part. The problem with that is that you're going to replace existing features, or you're going to modify the code. And if there are some new features into the claim module, you're going to have to rewrite these changes or make sure that they don't conflict. In the browser, if you go to the README of the openIMIS core, you can see that there's a section for the mutations and signals. The sections explains that there are a few signals that are triggered in the various mutations. So if I go back to the mutations of the claim module, and I can check for the create claim attachment mutation, I can see that we have an add claim attachment mutation, and we have some verification here, but this originates from the openIMIS mutation. The openIMIS mutation itself is going to, inside the processing, to call various signals. These signals are defined just here. There will be for each module a signal mutation for the validation, a signal mutation before mutating, and another one after mutating. So the validation allows you to react on the validation of a module. So if, for example, you want to submit a claim, you're going to validate that and make sure that the claim is valid to be entered. Otherwise, you're just going to return an error, and that will interrupt the processing. Or you can say, okay, I want to act after the validation. I just want to know that it's going to create a claim, but maybe I have to do something before it can be created, and I have to create a dependency first, or I can create and react after mutating. So how does it work? It's explained in the documentation, but let's say that we're going to take an example query. We want to create a claim attachment. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to create a type MP4 and with a URL. So this one gives me a UID for the mutation that has been performed. And I can now do a query on the mutation logs to see the status of the last one. So it's 44B0. So this is the one we have. If we go and decode this, we can see that's 44B0. So this mutation was performed successfully here in the status. So I want to act upon this. So to do that, I will need to go back to my code, and I will need to do the validate or the before mutating. So in this case, I will do the before mutating. So let's go to my mutations now. So if I go back to my module, I go back to my schema, and of course I'm not going to do one of my own mutations. If I copy paste from the example there we had, you can see that we have the module validate, but this one I want to do before mutating. Before mutating here, I want to do that on the claim, and I will have a method that is onClaim mutation. Of course, now the onClaim mutation is going to trigger exactly the trigger that is going to be for my own code. But you will see that I have some data about what exactly is called, because this is going to be triggered before every call to the claim module, to every mutation of the claim module. So it's not only just the claim attachment. So if I put a breakpoint there and try to submit the same mutation again, here I am, and my code is called, and I have in the parameters, I can see that we have a sender. The sender is actually not going to be that much helpful. So if I look at the quarks parameter, it passes all the details that have been provided to the mutation. And in this case, we have the mutation class that is add claim attachment mutation. So here I'm going to say that if the quarks of mutation class is what I have just received, so in the quarks we have the data itself, that is the object that we have received for this mutation. So I'm going to get the URL, or we can just get the data is equals to quarks data, and then we're going to say that we want data.url, and we're going to use that for a video.objects.create. Then we are going to create one that has URL equals data URL. Let's make sure that we have the right data. So we have URL and we have the title here. So URL, we'll have the video name being the title, the video name, this is the Python part. Video name equals the data title, and the location is optional. I could go to I could find the claim, but since this is the script and this is a dictionary, so if I go to the data, here I can find the claim UUID, but I would need to go and fetch the claim data to get the location from there. This is because the signals are serializing the information, so we cannot just pass the whole object to there. So we'll just do this for the moment. Say if there's a data URL, we want to do this. And we could say that if we don't have a URL, we could say that the errors that append, we can give it a message, no URL provided. Now start the query again, go step by step, so we see that it's indeed an add attachment claim. We have an URL and we create. So in this case, if you go back and see the videos, and now we can see that we have our test URL. Now if we try the same query again, we don't have a URL this time, so let's take the claim mutation, and in this case we're going to remove the URL, leave this. We're going to get this. You can see that we have received an error. In this case, there's a key error. In Python, if you just do this kind of access into a data dictionary and the element is not present, you get an error. So to go around that, you can say either URL in data, which would work in this case, or you can just say data.get. To fetch this because we're restarting. Okay. In this case, we're in the else, and we return an error. And we see that this one, we didn't get the error because this one has passed. So what happened? Well, we did change when we started. We did take the before mutating. If we switch to the validate, go back here. Instead, we do the validate instead of before mutating. Validate. So in this case, we need to import it here. Validate. Just try again. Here we go. Let's see the mutation logs now. And we can see that in this case we have received the message no URL provided, and status is indeed 1. So you can see that some of these steps can prevent the execution of the rest of the mutation. So we have seen here that we can create a module, we can connect it to the GraphQL, have it interact with the rest of the application. We can connect to the various points of this application. We could have also other modules that use our module now to plug into it. There is nothing else we need to do that. We'll now look at the internationalization. Our app has to be translated in various languages depending on the countries where they'll be deployed. So we need to implement that in the backend as well. Sometimes you can have error messages in the backend that are returned to the user, and you want these to be translated into the language of the users. To do that, we are going to modify here our mutation. The mutation currently only takes the video name parameter, so we're going to add the URL, required being false. And in the mutation, I'm going to say that if the data URL doesn't start with HTTPS YouTube, then we are going to, I'll just put a slash there, we are going to say that this is not correct. So you should not throw an exception, or if you do, it will be caught and handled accordingly, but it limits your abilities. So if you just return an object with a message, this being error should be a YouTube link, and just also provide a code, for example, and the code would be YouTube. So now if I save this, make sure that my server has refreshed, and as soon as that's done, we can go to the mutations. So if I take my mutation and now I try to save it with an URL that is not a YouTube link, what I'm going to do here is we get the same result because it's asynchronous, of course. So if we check the mutation logs, we'll see that we have status 1, that is an error. Here is the content of the request, and we have message error should be a YouTube link, and with this code. But we want to translate this first in English, but also in French, because my user that I configured here is actually using French as its language. So to do that, we're going to use a module that's called getText. So if I do getText and call this, sorry, just on the text, then I need to import it. I will import it from Django utils translation getText, and that will be right. However, it is in convention to use this to import it as underscore. And I can do just like this. It means that everywhere in the code you will see this call to getText this way. Of course, here this is going to be used as the key to access your translation. So I could leave this, and it would be by default this translation that will be displayed if there is no translation even in the default language. But it's better to use a link like video.error.youtube. So with this, Now I need to actually generate this translation. So if I go back now to this query, and I go back to my imitation and try it again, of course the server is refreshing. Here we are. Let's take the logs. Here I can see the error code. So we need to generate the data to do that. And if we look at the documentation, we'll see that to manage the translation of your module, you should have from your module root dir execute .openIMIS py getText.sh. This will extract all your translation keys from your code into your module, and this is the place where it's going to be. So now let's do that. I'm in my video module, and I run the same that exact command. Nothing much seemed to have happened, but it did generate, if everything went well, in my video folder, there's a locale now with en and a django.po. You can, of course, customize the various details here about the revision dates, the language, and all the details, but normally everything that is mandatory is already filled in. And we have this error, this message that we have defined in video schema.py 48. And we can say error, please provide a YouTube link. I'm going to save this. But if I just do that, nothing is going to happen because this language file is not compiled and it's only in my module. So to be able to do that, I need to run a Python command that is not specific to this modular version. And I have to run it this time, not from my video, but from my openIMIS folder. And I'm going to run the manage command and do a compile messages. It's going to do a lot of output. It's trying to find all the translations that are available. And now we can see that it created a django.mo file. And that file is actually binary, so we'll not be able to read it. And it will be assembled when the application starts. So in this case, we really need to restart the application so that it's browsing again all these folders that are not monitored. And as soon as it is done, we can switch back to my mutation. Just try the mutation again. See what it said. And we can see error, please provide a YouTube link. However, this is a YouTube link. This is an error message in English, but my user is actually in French. So what we're going to do is now to add French translations. How do we do that? Well, it's pretty easy. We have the locale en. We can just copy and create it as French. Of course, I don't need the compiled messages, just need the regular ones. And here I have the message, so I can say erreur, veuillez fournir un lien YouTube. Now we need to restart it again to compile first. So we're going to run the compile messages again. Now we can switch back to my command and just try once more. Mutation logs. And we can see that we have the message in French. Now there are a few other scripts that are provided. Like if you're developing into the core, there is also a script that is called localize upload. This script is going to upload the data to the API of localize to load this. If you want to do that, you need to have the localize API key that is specific to your own user, so it can be retrieved on the server and sent to the right places. In some situations, you might encounter a problem that you need to have the translation done only late into the call. So for example, if I want to add a description here, I cannot do that by having just the underscore and then my message there, because this one is going to be translated when I do this call. So this order Django filtered connection feed is actually executed when the class is defined, when it's passed for the first time here. So, and not really when it is instantiated. So what you need to do in these cases is to use a getText lazy. It's in the same module. It will allow you to define an error message that will only be evaluated when the description is actually read and to be sent to the browser. And it works exactly the same way. So if I add an error video.error.youtube, I'm going to, and I run the getText, I will find it into the Django.py. And last but not least, we need to test our application. So this is not going to show you how to do testing, how to do mocking, how to do any of the typical things, but it's only going to show you how you can run the tests within the context of this modular architecture of openIMIS. Okay, now that we have the internationalization, we should be able to do some testing. To do the tests, you will see that they are in the tests.py. There's nothing yet. And there are a few ways that you can create a test case, but the Django recommended way is to use a class. To do that, you just use my video test class, make it inherit from test case, and define some methods. So test dummy, and here we're going to do a self.assert true, false. This is going to fail for sure. Now we have this test that should be failing. We need to run it. To run the tests, if we switch to the module, the documentation, we can see here that we have to run unit tests on a module. So we're going to do the first thing we need to do is to initialize the test database. It's not the same as the one that is used by the server. So if I come back to the openIMIS folder, I can run the Python init test db. This is going to create the database with the test data. There we are. Now if we see where we can run that, we need to do the manage.py test --keep. Be careful that this Django, in Django 2 and before that was called, you could do -k, but this has now a different meaning, so it will have unpredictable results. So in this case, we're going to then provide the test, the module that we want to test. So still in the same place, run the manage.py. Then we're going to do the test video --keep. And we can see that we ran our test here, and we had one failure. In this video, we're not going to introduce the full details of how you can do tests with Django. This is a very complex topic. You can do a lot of things that are quite easy. We're just going to go through a few of them. The first thing that you might want to do is to define a setup class. The setup is going to be run every time you start this test suite. So you could say, for example, that I want to do a test video. Now that I have this, I can use then I want to just in my test dummy, we can just say, okay, well, I want to make sure that the assert is not none, of the self.test video. So this will work. This video object that we just created will remain. So it means that if you run it a number of times, you will have a lot of videos that are created. So it is usually a good practice to delete everything you create like this. Okay, now that we have, in the end, we're going to do a teardown. So we're going to say self.testvideo.delete. So that we clean up after ourselves. Now if we run the test again, the advantage of using the -- keep means that we can run it again very quickly. And of course, we see that it's video name. Oops. And this should pass. So one of the places you can use to find some helpers for the to create some test data, because sometimes you want to be doing some more complex setups. One of the great places to look for is test validations. In this example, we have the creation of quite complex services. It can be quite simple, like this one. We have a claim, and we use the create test claim. And then you have a claim service within that claim. We have a claim category, and then just do that and just do the test, and then we delete it. Be careful when you do the deletes that you might need to have some to delete the dependencies, and you need to do it in a specific order. Otherwise, you just it's going to give referential integrity errors when you tear down the test. These various helpers are situated in every module. They have their own test helpers.py. So each can define how to create easily one of such objects. They are created with the custom props. So if you just call them without any parameters, you'll get a sensible default claim in this case. But if you want to specify some particular parameters because you want to test some specific values, for example, if you want to have a specific health facility ID, you can just provide it with the custom props, saying health facility ID contains this information. It works with all the fields. With a note that if you do that for foreign keys, you need to use it's better to use the ID because that's where they are assigned usually. So if you assign both the ID and the object, you might have some weird results. And this is how you can make such a more complex setup and run it. Sometimes be careful that you might want to refresh from database, because if the transaction that is updating the object is not really the same, you might need to refresh it so that the objects are reloaded from disk. And that's it. Then you should have the ability to do all the tests you want. You can create more than one test service. The important thing is that your class should have test in the name. The module that you're running should have test, should start with test. And in this case, it should inherit from the test case. Also, within that class, all the methods need to start with test something, otherwise they'll not be called. So if I add a new one, and I say def not executed, and then I just do a self.assert true false, as I did earlier. Then I switch to here, it will still work. Because this is not a test that has to be executed. So if I then run it, name it test, not executed, then it will be run. So, what did we learn in this video? We saw how to secure the access to the data, make sure that only the users that are allowed can see their specific data. We have seen how to extend other modules, how to make sure that security also is applied on other modules. We translated our module to be in any language that we are going to deploy, and we saw how to do testing into the application. In the next video, we'll see how we can trigger a batch processing and how to monitor it, and we'll see how to generate PDFs with customization template for every country.